When you go into no contact, most men believe the purpose is to make her miss them. They think distance erases emotion or forces clarity. But what actually happens is far more subtle and far more powerful. No contact doesn't remove attachment. It removes emotional certainty. And when certainty disappears, the emotional system reacts. Before no contact, there is usually a predictable emotional rhythm. She knows when you'll respond, how available you are, and how much influence her behavior has over your emotional state. That predictability creates comfort, even when attraction is unstable. The moment you step back emotionally, that structure collapses. And when structure collapses, the need to understand what changed becomes urgent. This is where testing begins, not because she wants attention and not because she's confused. Testing begins because she no longer knows where she stands emotionally with you. And emotional uncertainty creates internal pressure that demands resolution. Most men misunderstand this stage. They think tests mean she's losing interest. But people don't test what they don't care about. Testing only happens when emotional relevance still exists. She's trying to reestablish her emotional footing, not walk away. No contact shifts the balance of emotional control. When you're no longer emotionally accessible on demand, she loses the ability to predict outcomes. And predictability is how emotional safety is maintained. So the emotional system reacts by probing. These probes can look harmless: a casual message, a familiar tone, a sudden warmth followed by silence. But they all serve the same purpose: to gather information. Information about whether your emotional center is still positioned around her. If you react the same way you always did, certainty returns immediately. She now knows nothing changed. The dynamic resets. But if your emotional center has moved, if you remain calm, steady, and self-contained, the test fails. And when a test fails, something important happens internally. She can no longer rely on the old emotional map. The relationship landscape feels unfamiliar again, and unfamiliarity forces reassessment. Men often sabotage this stage by trying to explain themselves. They think clarity will reduce tension, but clarity kills the very uncertainty that creates attraction. Attraction thrives in balanced uncertainty, not emotional reassurance. Another mistake is interpreting testing as manipulation. It's not. It's reflexive. Emotional systems seek balance. When balance is disrupted, behavior adjusts automatically. Understanding this prevents you from reacting personally. No contact only works when it produces internal stability. Silence without emotional growth creates tension, but stability without reaction creates strength, and strength shifts perception without needing words. When she can no longer pull predictable emotional reactions from you, curiosity replaces control. Curiosity leads to attention. Attention leads to investment. This is the natural progression when emotional certainty is removed. It's also why chasing after tests is so damaging. Chasing hands certainty back instantly. It restores emotional hierarchy. An attraction doesn't rebuild in a hierarchy where one person is emotionally dependent. So when tests appear after no contact, don't see them as setbacks. They're signals that the old emotional structure no longer works. And when something no longer works, change becomes possible. Because tests don't show that attachment is gone. They show that emotional certainty is, and that's where real transformation begins. After no contact, when she begins to test you, the real question she's trying to answer isn't whether you still care. She already knows you did. What she's trying to understand is whether your emotional center has actually shifted or if it's still positioned around her reactions the way it was before. Before the separation, your emotional responses were likely predictable. She knew what would trigger reassurance. She knew what tone would pull you in. She knew how quickly your energy would change based on her behavior. That predictability created a sense of control, even if the relationship felt unstable. When no contact disrupts that pattern, the control disappears, and with it, her certainty. Testing is how the emotional system gathers information. She applies pressure and watches where it lands. Does silence create anxiety? Does warmth create urgency? Does distance pull you into explanation? Each reaction gives her clarity about your emotional position. This is why tests aren't verbal. She doesn't ask if you've changed. She creates situations that would have triggered you before and observes whether they still do. Emotional change is felt, not explained. Most men fail here because they think growth needs to be demonstrated. They try to show confidence, maturity, or understanding through words. But emotional strength doesn't announce itself. It shows up as calm consistency. If your emotional center hasn't shifted, tests work immediately. You respond quickly. You lean in emotionally. You seek reassurance. And in doing so, you confirm that no contact didn't change the internal dynamic. It only paused it. But when your emotional center has moved, the experience is different. You don't feel pulled. You don't feel the need to stabilize the emotional environment. You remain present without urgency. That absence of reaction creates uncertainty on her side instead of yours, and uncertainty forces reevaluation. Reevaluation isn't about deciding whether to come back. It's about recalibrating how she feels in your presence, whether the emotional environment has changed, whether reconnecting would feel balanced instead of overwhelming. This is why mixed signals often follow failed tests. She increases emotional contrast to see if a stronger stimulus will create movement. And again, the reaction, or lack of it, answers the question. Men often confuse restraint with indifference, but restraint is active self-regulation, not emotional shutdown. You're not withholding emotion to punish. You're simply no longer emotionally dependent. Another common mistake is overcorrecting. Men become overly guarded, cold, or distant because they're afraid of failing the test. But fear itself is a reaction, and reaction is what the test is measuring. Passing the test doesn't require perfection. It requires stability. You don't need to time responses precisely or craft perfect messages. You just need to stay emotionally centered regardless of her behavior. When she feels that her actions no longer dictate your emotional state, something fundamental shifts. Respect begins to return, and respect is the foundation attraction rebuilds on. This is also why chasing clarity after no contact is so destructive. When you ask for answers, you're asking her to regulate your emotional state, and emotional authority handed over is rarely returned willingly. So when testing begins, don't ask what to say. Ask where your emotional center is located. If it's still orbiting her reactions, the test will expose it. If it's grounded in self-regulation, the test will dissolve. Because when your emotional center has truly shifted, her behavior no longer pulls you into chasing. It pulls her into reassessing the entire dynamic instead. After no contact, mixed signals are one of the most misunderstood experiences men face. One moment she seems warm, curious, or even open. The next moment she goes distant, slow, or silent. Most men interpret this as confusion or indecision, but mixed signals are rarely accidental. They are deliberate emotional pressure designed to see if you will abandon your center and chase clarity. When no contact disrupts emotional certainty, the emotional system looks for a way to restore balance. Mixed signals create contrast, and contrast creates movement. Warmth pulls you in, distance pushes you away, and the space between those two extremes is where emotional reactions surface. She isn't confused, she's observing. She's watching to see which version of her behavior still controls your emotional state. Does warmth make you lean forward? Does distance create anxiety? Do you feel compelled to explain, reassure, or pursue? The moment you do, the test answers itself. Most men fall into the trap of trying to solve mixed signals. They ask questions, they seek clarity, they try to stabilize the emotional environment. But clarity is the reward of emotional security, not the tool to create it. When you chase clarity, you communicate urgency. And urgency tells her that uncertainty still controls you. Attraction doesn't grow in urgency, it retreats from it. Mixed signals work because they trigger old emotional patterns. If, in the past, you responded to distance by chasing and to warmth by investing more, those patterns become predictable. After no contact, she reintroduces those stimuli to see if the patterns still exist. If they do, certainty returns instantly. She now knows your emotional position hasn't changed. The dynamic resets without effort. But if mixed signals don't move you, something different happens. Emotional leverage disappears. And when leverage disappears, curiosity replaces control. Men often think they need to respond correctly to mixed signals, but there is no correct response in words. The response is emotional steadiness. Warmth doesn't inflate you. Distance doesn't deflate you. You remain consistent. This consistency feels unfamiliar to her, and unfamiliarity breaks old emotional scripts. When the script breaks, she can no longer predict outcomes, and unpredictability, when paired with stability, reignites attraction. Another mistake men make is overreacting by pulling away completely. They think distance equals strength. But emotional avoidance is still reaction, and reaction is what the test is measuring. Strength is presence without urgency, engagement without dependence, silence without tension. When you don't chase clarity, the emotional pressure reverses. Instead of you wondering where you stand, she begins wondering why her behavior isn't affecting you the way it used to. This inward questioning is where emotional investment grows. Investment doesn't come from effort, it comes from unresolved emotional tension. Mixed signals are also a boundary test. She's checking whether access to your emotional energy is still automatic or now regulated by self-respect. Boundaries don't need to be stated, they're felt through behavior. When your emotional center remains stable, mixed signals lose their power. They stop creating anxiety and start creating curiosity. And curiosity keeps her emotionally engaged without you chasing. So when mixed signals appear after no contact, don't label them as confusion. See them as evaluation. She's checking whether you'll pursue certainty or remain grounded. And when you remain grounded, the test no longer pulls you into chasing. It pulls her into reassessing the entire dynamic instead. After no contact, one of the most common ways she tests you is through familiarity. It doesn't come as an emotional confession or a dramatic reach out. It comes as something light, casual, almost harmless, a message that sounds like nothing changed. And that's exactly why it's powerful. Familiarity bypasses logic. It reaches straight into habit, into old roles, into the version of you that used to respond automatically. She's not trying to reconnect fully in that moment. She's checking whether the emotional door still opens the same way it used to. Before no contact, familiarity meant emotional access. She knew how to speak to you in a way that triggered warmth, availability, and investment. That access created emotional leverage. When no contact removes that leverage, the emotional system reaches for what once worked. This is why the tone feels casual. Casual contact doesn't expose intention. It allows observation without vulnerability. She can gather information without risking rejection. Men often misread this. They assume casual messages mean low interest or friendliness. But familiarity isn't about interest level. It's about control. She's testing whether familiarity still pulls you into the same emotional posture. If you respond with the same energy, the same immediacy, the same emotional openness, the test succeeds. She regains certainty. The dynamic resets without a conversation ever happening. This is also why familiarity is dangerous for men who haven't changed internally. It feels safe, comfortable, natural, and comfort makes old behavior return. Passing this test doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means becoming aware. Awareness creates choice, and choice is what signals growth. When your emotional center has shifted, familiarity feels different. You're still polite, still calm, still present, but you're no longer pulled. You don't accelerate the interaction emotionally. You let it unfold at a natural pace. Another mistake men make here is overcorrecting. They sense the test and become dry, rigid, or defensive. That creates tension and breaks natural flow. Tests aren't passed through resistance, they're passed through regulation. You don't reject familiarity. You regulate it. You don't rush to restore closeness. You allow closeness to build naturally if it's meant to. She's watching subtle things, response timing, emotional tone, whether you try to extend the conversation, whether you seek reassurance or clarity. These details reveal whether your emotional center still leans toward her. If familiarity no longer gives her certainty, curiosity replaces control. Curiosity keeps her emotionally engaged, and engagement without certainty is where attraction grows. This stage is also where many men sabotage progress by revisiting the past. Familiarity can make it feel safe to explain, apologize, or reopen old wounds, but doing that pulls the dynamic backward. Growth doesn't need explanation. It's felt through consistency. When familiarity stops working the way it used to, something shifts internally for her. She realizes the old emotional map doesn't apply anymore. And when the map changes, behavior must change too. She may increase engagement, ask more questions, invest more emotionally, or she may pull back to reassess. Either way, the test has done its job. So when casual familiarity shows up after no contact, don't see it as meaningless. See it as diagnostic. She's checking whether she still has the same emotional access. And when she doesn't, the old dynamic stays closed, creating space for a healthier one to form. After no contact, one of the quickest ways men undo everything they've built is by chasing. And chasing doesn't always look dramatic. It can be subtle. It can sound reasonable. It can even feel mature. But emotionally, chasing always sends the same message, that your stability depends on her response. No contact works because it restores polarity. It creates space, mystery, and emotional independence. That independence is what shifts the dynamic. The moment you chase, that polarity collapses. And when polarity collapses, attraction collapses with it. Chasing isn't just messaging repeatedly or begging. It shows up as over-explaining, seeking reassurance, trying to fix the emotional environment, asking where things stand. Any behavior driven by emotional urgency qualifies as chasing. Tests are designed to invite this behavior. Mixed signals create anxiety. Silence creates uncertainty. Casual reach-outs create hope. And hope mixed with uncertainty is the perfect trigger for pursuit. When you chase, you relieve your own discomfort, but you hand emotional certainty back to her. And certainty removes the need for attraction to rebuild. Most men think effort creates attraction, but effort creates comfort, not desire. Desire requires emotional tension, and tension only exists when both people are emotionally self-contained. Chasing communicates emotional hunger. Even if your words sound calm, the energy underneath is felt. And emotional hunger pushes attraction away because it creates pressure instead of pull. This is why reassurance seeking is so damaging. When you ask for clarity, you're not just asking a question, you're transferring emotional authority. You're saying your internal state depends on her answer, and once emotional authority is given away, it's rarely returned. Men often justify chasing as communication or vulnerability, but vulnerability without stability becomes burden. Instead of feeling drawn in, she feels responsible for your emotional state. Responsibility drains attraction. Another trap is thinking more investment will fix uncertainty, but investment without balance creates imbalance, and imbalance is what caused the disconnection in the first place. When you chase after no contact, you undo the shift that occurred. You show her that nothing changed internally, and once she knows that, testing stops, not because attraction returned, but because certainty did. Men who pass this stage don't do anything impressive. They don't withdraw dramatically. They don't apply pressure. They simply stop chasing emotional outcomes. They allow interaction to unfold without steering it. They respond when it feels natural. They disengage when it feels forced. And they do both without emotional charge. This calm non-attachment is unsettling in a good way. It forces her to invest emotionally if she wants momentum. And emotional investment is the engine of attraction. When you don't chase, something shifts inside her. She starts wondering why you're not trying to pull her closer, why you're not seeking reassurance, why you seem settled regardless of outcome. That curiosity creates engagement. Engagement creates momentum. Momentum creates reconnection. Chasing feels like control, but it's surrender. Restraint feels passive, but it's leadership. Leadership doesn't force, it holds space. So, if you want attraction to move forward instead of backward, stop trying to secure outcomes emotionally. When you stop chasing certainty, attraction finally has room to move toward you instead. After no contact, the final and most important realization is this: you don't pass her tests by doing more. You pass them by becoming more centered. Most men believe they need to say the right thing, respond at the right time, or show the right level of interest. But emotional tests aren't about performance, they're about presence. When she tests you, she's not listening closely to your words. She's watching your emotional movement. She's observing whether her behavior still pulls you off balance or whether you remain grounded in yourself. Reaction used to give her certainty. Restraint takes that certainty away. Restraint doesn't mean shutting down or acting indifferent. It means regulating your emotional responses so they're no longer automatic. You're not suppressing emotion. You're choosing not to let emotion control you. This is where most men misunderstand strength. They think strength looks like dominance, distance, or silence. But true strength is composure. Composure is calm, stable, and consistent, and it's felt instantly. When composure is present, the old tests stop working. Mixed signals don't create urgency. Familiarity doesn't pull you backward. Silence doesn't trigger anxiety. And when the tools stop working, the emotional system must adapt. At this stage, she stops testing and starts observing. Testing seeks reaction. Observation seeks understanding. And understanding is where respect begins. Men often sabotage this phase by trying to speed things up. They think restraint means waiting for the perfect moment to act. But restraint isn't about waiting. It's about not forcing. Forcing outcomes creates resistance. Allowing space creates movement. Another mistake is confusing restraint with emotional withdrawal. Withdrawal is avoidance. Restraint is engagement without dependence. You're present but not attached to outcome. Open but not needy. This emotional posture signals maturity, and maturity creates safety. Not the safety of predictability, but the safety of balance. When she feels that your emotional state no longer depends on her responses, a new dynamic forms. She can engage without feeling responsible. She can invest without feeling pressured. And that's where attraction stabilizes. Restraint also communicates self-respect. You're no longer available on demand emotionally, not because you're withholding, but because your energy is governed by your values, not her reactions. This is when polarity locks in, not through effort, not through persuasion, through presence. Men who reach this stage often notice a subtle shift. She initiates more, she asks questions, she opens emotionally. The tests fade because they're no longer needed. Attraction doesn't disappear when tests stop. It strengthens because it's no longer built on uncertainty or control. It's built on respect and balance. So if you're in no contact and testing begins, don't look for a move to make. Look for a state to maintain, because the man who doesn't react isn't weak, he's centered. And center is where attraction naturally returns.